even more key was Mozart. And while Lafayette was in America, he left for America in 1777. Mozart came to Paris in 1778. It's very interesting for a number of reasons. He was immediately made the court organist to the court of Versailles, where he had access to Marie Antoinette, among other people. He spent 10 days at the estate of Lafayette's in-laws. And the man that he was working with was a man named Johann Christian Bach, who was the youngest son of Johann Sebastian Bach, who was at the time working out of London and come over, I guess, to work with Mozart. Now, this did not sit well with certain people. Within a few days, Mozart found his luggage loaded onto a carriage that was headed out of France. He was given a one-way ticket out of France and never allowed to come back again. The idea of this great musical genius, in connecting up with these various networks in a political crisis like was facing France and Europe, just was something people like the Duc d'Orléans were not going to allow to happen. However, their victory was, very short-lived, because what Mozart did in Austria, in Vienna, was even stronger. Now, his residence there, which was 10 years, almost exactly coincided with the reign of Joseph II. Joseph II reigned from 1780 to 1790. And he is the brother of Marie Antoinette, who, by the way, has been given a very raw deal in terms of the way history has treated her. She could have played a very important role, and we'll hear a little bit more about her later. But so you have this family is, very important in the potential to bring the American Revolution into Europe. Emperor Joseph, during this period of time, he attempted, and he had a fair amount of success at introducing reforms. He had the serfs given their freedom. He had the large estates busted up. He had modern agricultural technology introduced. He had public hospitals, medical training, education spread throughout the population to develop a middle class. And he had a national theater, of which we have a picture, I think. He knew, much of the entertainment was done, that was of any serious nature, was done in Italian, which was fine for the oligarchs. They knew some Italian. But if you wanted to organize the population, you had to have a national theater in the national language, which was German. And that was actually set up by Joseph in 1776. This was the Bergtheater, where the performances of both plays and operas took place. The oligarchy, as they usually do, tried to change the subject away from the American Revolution, away from the reforms, to guess what? A war against Muslims. Sound familiar? There had been various wars between Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The last one had been in 1683. And there was an attempt made to start a new war between Austria and the Turks. The Grand Duke Paul of Russia was sent into Austria, to Vienna, to put the pressure on the emperor to go to war. The emperor and Mozart had different ideas. And the emperor assigned Mozart to put together an opera which became known as The Abduction from the Seraglio. Now, Mozart based this on a play that was called Belmonte and Costanza, but he changed the ending. In the play, when the hero gets in trouble, he gets out of the crisis because his enemy finds out that he's really his son, and so they, make up and they're happy and everybody lives happily ever after. Mozart completely changed the ending, as I'll tell you in just a minute. Now, Joseph assigned his closest advisor, a man named Gunther, Johann Valentin Gunther. He was known as the man closest to the emperor. He spent many hours every day alone with the emperor. He had gone on a trip to Russia, which was a very secret, very confidential mission. He was the one person Joseph took. So you see, and he was the one who was assigned by the emperor to work with Mozart. to develop the abduction from the Seraglio. And 3 weeks before the first performance, the librettist, the leading tenor, Gunther and Mozart had a working dinner. And the next morning, Gunther was arrested as a Prussian spy and jailed. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't believe coincidentally at all, Friedrich Schiller was arrested that very same day in the Principality of Württemberg. Now, when I talk about families, the Württemberg aristocracy, one of the daughters was married to Grand Duke Paul of Russia, the one that was trying to get the war going, and one of the other ones became the fiancée and then the wife of the Emperor Franz, who succeeded his father Leopold, who succeeded Joseph, who was, as you will find out, a really evil bastard, pardon my French, but it's the only appropriate word for this guy. So you had, and it was Karl Eugen of Württemberg, the Duke in charge of Württemberg, who had Schiller arrested for disobeying him and writing a play. Schiller was able to, he was let out on the promise of good behavior, and he immediately left the area and never came back again. Now, what did Mozart do with this composition? Can we do the picture and the music at the same time on this one? Okay. This is a picture from the abduction of the Seraglio, and this is the beginning of the overture.
Was that painted from the original?
I don't know. I'd love to have us watch the whole opera. It's a great opera. Time does not permit. So this premiered in July of 1782. And it's interesting because the aim was to use it to counter-organize against Paul, and he went off and organized around Europe to try and get, you know, a war going and support the aristocracy. Came back to Vienna in 1782 when this opera was being performed. At the time, they would actually hire people to go in and hiss and try and disrupt the opera to prevent people from being able to hear it and to try and, you know, destroy it from going anywhere, which was done with the abduction from the Seraglio. But despite that, you know, after the first couple of attempts, you know, people liked it so much that it just became a resounding success. It was the best known of Mozart's operas during the 9 years of his life. It was performed in 40 cities all over Europe. Also, the writer of the play originally threatened to sue. Said his, you know, this changing of his words and it was just absolutely irresponsible, and he was going to sue Mozart and blah, blah, blah. Within about a year, he was writing in an arts publication, "This is exactly what I did. This is, you know, wonderful." So it gives you an idea of what a success it was.
Wow.
But most importantly, it postponed a war with Turkey for 6 years. They did manage to get a war with Turkey in 1788, but that was 6 years later. Now, Mozart, however, was not a lone revolutionary, as the coin or paraphrase a term from these days. He was at the center of at least 3 major American networks in Vienna. The first one was the network of Baron von Swieten, who had musical seminars. The second was the Salon of Countess Wilhelmina Thun, and the third was the Masonic Order of Ignaz von Born. We'll go back to von Swieten if you would. Yeah, this is Baron von Swieten, Baron Gottfried von Swieten. He was the president. He was part of, he was like a cabinet minister in the court of Joseph II. He was the head of the court library, and he was also the head of the Court Commission on Education. At that time, Bach's works and also Handel's works were not particularly well known in most of Europe, especially not in Vienna. And he organized salons where he had them played every Sunday afternoon from 12 to 2. And at those meetings were, among the important things, was a development of the fugue and the capability of Mozart to use fugues. Do you have that picture of the quartet? One of the things that Mozart did, and I'm sorry, I could not find a picture of a trio, so we had to have a quartet, but that is Haydn. Mozart took the fugues of Bach and transcribed them for a string trio. And then they played them, Haydn, Mozart, various other people, Count Lichnowsky, who I'll tell you a little bit more about, later, who was also a key, person in the Joseph II administration. They would play through these things and work through them. And a fugue is basically an advanced form of musical dialogue. You start out with one idea in a particular pitch, introduce another one, or the same general idea in a slightly different pitch, and various voices in dialogue until you develop a new idea. It's one of those most advanced musical concepts. Now, one of the people who was key in those seminars was a man named Joseph Sonnenfels. This is a very interesting man. He was given the supposedly technical job. He was Jewish, by the way, and being Jewish in Vienna in the 1780s was not an easy life. I'll let you look up more yourselves, but it was not an easy life. So it was unusual to have a Jewish person in that position. He was put in charge of the supposedly nominal task of codifying the Austro-Hungarian law. But what he did was to decide which things were actually in line with natural law, with the principles of the way the universe was organized, and anything that wasn't, he left them out. So he basically rewrote the Austro-Hungarian law from the standpoint of natural law when he was, doing this supposed administrative work of codifying them. There was also Prince Lichnowsky, who's the person who took Mozart to Prussia, where he visited many of the same places that that Bach had played, and also Mozart met many of Schiller's friends, including the poet Kerner. Now we need the Baroness. This is Baroness von Thun. And if the center of the musical life of this American network was with Baron von Swieten's seminars, it was at her salon that was the center of the ongoing political and cultural discussions. Typical evening, you would have various leading political and cultural figures discussing Lessing's plays, discussing the political situation, playing Mozart's latest opera. When he was writing The Abduction from the Seraglio, as he got every part finished, he sent it over to Baroness von Thun so it could be performed there. Among the people who were there were the Chancellor of the Austrian Empire, Prince Kaunitz, and oftentimes the Emperor himself. So they were involving the Emperor at the highest level of discussion of ideas. She also, this Countess, brought Beethoven to Vienna in 1787 to meet Mozart. And two of her sons-in-law including Count Lichnowsky, became supporters of Beethoven. So this network continued. This is just the kind of thing, this is from a painting of Mozart, playing that Unborn. Now, one of the most interesting and obviously controversial figures and centers of this thing was this man, Ignaz von Born. Born was the head of a Masonic lodge, but he developed his Masonic lodge in order to pull the Masons away from alchemy and Rosicrucianism and secrecy, and all this sort of thing. His idea was to use Masonry as a tool for developing science and the notion of science, the information about technology, and to use it to develop. The Masons were spreading all over Europe at the time, and you had most of the nobility and a lot of the bourgeoisie in these Masonic lodges. So rather than just ignore them, he moved to try and take them over and use them for a completely different purpose. And people who are familiar with the magic flute can have a sense of how Mozart thought about that. His lodge was called, where is it? Zum wahren Eintracht, the True Harmony. And Haydn was a member of that lodge. Mozart was active in it, even though he was a member of another lodge. This man was an expert in metallurgy. He was very, very important in the development of the mining industry in Austria. And some of the most advanced science in the late 1700s was involved in mining and metallurgy. These lodges had libraries, they had journals of all kinds, which were used to spread this knowledge and create a discussion of the leading scientific and technological. I think I lost a page. Sorry. Hold everything. Well, I don't know where it went.
Look this.
Moving right along.
Yeah. It is thought, and next picture. It's thought that Benjamin Franklin wrote a letter to Joseph II, basically praising the metallurgical developments. And as everybody knows, Ben Franklin was quite a scientist. That he wrote a letter to the emperor praising what Ignaz von Born was doing, just to get a sense of who he was. Now, above all of this, or the context for all of this was the German language project, and unfortunately, it only lasted in terms of Mozart's period in Vienna, from 1781 to 83, and that's what I'm missing, is the whole thing about the abduction. This is what Mozart did in his opera. The opera is about a woman named Costanza. She's a noblewoman, and she and her servant Blonda and her fiance's servant Pedrillo get shipwrecked and end up in the court of a Turkish pasha. Without going into all the details, the Belmonte, who's the fiance, comes to rescue them. He's a European nobleman, and they get caught as they're trying to escape. So they're brought in front of the pasha. And Belmonte, being a nobleman, figures he knows how to get out of this. So he says, look, you want to let me go. I mean, I'm from such and such family, I got a lot of money, my family will do whatever, they'll pay you to do this. And here's what the pasha says. Oh, it was your father, that barbarian. Because of him, I was forced to leave my native land. His insatiable greed deprived me of my beloved, whom I cherished more than my own life. He robbed me of honor, property, everything. He destroyed all my happiness. So, this is a problem. Belmonte, the hero, quote unquote, responds, "Cool your wrath on me. Avenge the wrong done to you by my father. Your anger is justified, and I'm prepared for anything." Now imagine what the audience is expecting to have come next. However, to the shock of the audience as well as of Belmonte, the Pasha announces, "It must be very natural for your family to do wrong, as you assume that I am the same way. But you deceive yourself. I despise your father far too much ever to behave as he did. Have your freedom. Take a stanza, sail home and tell your father that you were in my power and that I set you free, so that you could tell him it is a far greater pleasure to repay injustice with good deeds than evil with evil." Now, this caused a sensation, a virtual hurricane in the Vienna of the time, because the most Christian person in the play was the Muslim. And the supposed Christians were not too Christian. Now, the problem is, however, that outside of that opera, there was almost nothing of a high quality done in the German National Theater. The oligarchs figured that it was for the hoi polloi, the poor people, the middle class. They didn't need uplifting. They wouldn't like it anyway. Where people are always telling you, well, Americans are too stupid to understand the ideas you're talking about. That was basically the idea of the nobility toward the population. So they fed them all kinds of what soap opera kind of material, till it was finally closed down. But that was only the beginning of the fight. Now I want to digress for a minute to give you a window into the mindset of the two factions that were fighting it out in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that is through the case of a man named Angelo Soliman. This is Angelo Soliman. He was a freed black slave who became a distinguished citizen in Vienna. He was a brilliant chess player. He was, distinguished and well known. He, thanks to the Viennese secret police, who kept very, very careful records on everything, we know that he and Mozart went to the Born Lodge, Masonic Lodge, together very frequently. Now, he married the widow of a Dutch nobleman, or of a Dutch general, and he was married in the same church where Mozart was married. So we don't know that much about their relationship, but we know a little bit. However, after the death of Emperor Joseph, which was in 1790, and then his brother and successor Leopold, which I think was in 92, and also Mozart was dead, Born was dead, then you had the coming in of the other faction, and that was under the rule of Emperor Franz. After Soliman died in 1796, the Emperor Franz had his body seized from his family over the objections of the Catholic Archbishop. He had him stuffed and mounted and put in a museum along with wild animals. So you have two views of humanity fighting it out. Mozart and the American faction, who believed in the creativity and the goodness of man, and then just pure satanic evil. That's the fight we're talking about. So when you're talking about bringing the American system to Europe, you're not just talking about making things a little bit better. You're talking about, just like now, we're not talking about making things a little bit better. We're talking about defeating pure evil. Mozart continued in various ways. I have as Senator McCarthy used to say about the communists in the United States, I have in my hand here a list of, this is an 8-page list of Mozart's compositions just from 1786 to 1791. So from the time he was 30 to the time he was 35, people were, welcome to just take a look. It's amazing what this man did. And I'm not going to try and cover, much more about most of them, because there's way too much. But you did have two things. Once Mozart after the the German National Theater was shut down, was restricted to doing operas in Italian, which meant that they were mostly aimed at the nobility. They're the ones who knew Italian. So Mozart aimed at the nobility, all right, in a very tough way. He wrote an opera called The Marriage of Figaro, written to the play of that same name. Now, the play was written by Pierre Beaumarchais, who was a Frenchman, who was the man who made ship supplies to the American Revolution before the French nation was supporting America. And he wrote a very, very tough play, which they banned in France. Louis XVI's court banned it. Well, very interestingly, who do you think was responsible for making sure that it did get performed eventually in France? Marie Antoinette. So there's a lot of interesting things we don't know about her and about that family in this period. Joseph II's sister. In any case, when it was translated into German and brought in as a play into Vienna, it was also banned in Vienna by the emperor. But Mozart, together with a librettist named De Ponte, wrote an opera. And this was absolutely what the emperor needed in his battle with the nobility. Because if people know the Marriage of Figaro, what you have is a count who claims to have gone along with the reforms. Oh yes, the first night, right, to have the first night with the new bride, that's old, we don't do that anymore, we're reformed now. Which was basically the way the nobility was trying to deal with the reforms of Joseph II. To give it lip service, but not actually carry out any of the reforms. So, in Marriage of Figaro, how the Count says we don't any longer have this idea of the man, the nobleman getting to sleep with the bride the first night of her marriage. That was an old traditional feudal custom.
In the marriage.
Anywhere.
Nobility, that was the nobility fight.
Well, wait, you do sleep with your wife.
No, the nobleman sleeps with the wife.
Not the husband.
Of the guy.
The
Lord, the Lord.
Okay.
The Lord.
Oh,
They
so
both-
that would have been Figaro, are you saying?
Yeah, in
Yes.
Figaro
Yes.
is the Count,
Right.
wanting to sleep with Figaro's wife, Suzanne.
Okay, Suzanne, that's why the bedroom was supposed to be next.
Yeah.
So there was there was a tradition of that?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
That was the
Several
one.
times
What
on
the
that.
senor?
That was a
Right.
So like many of the feudal traditions that the emperor Joseph II was trying to eliminate with his reforms, he was getting the same, oh yes, fine, I'll do that, to his face, and then to his back, they were undermining what he was doing. So Mozart, wrote the opera that went exactly after that in a very tough, very humorous way, which became a major success in 1786. And then the other one I want to just mention is the opera Don Giovanni, which hit even harder. Because what you had at that time were operations against Joseph by Casanova, the famous ladies' man, and by a man named Cagliostro in France, who was running operations against Marie Antoinette. And so Mozart wrote an opera, Don Giovanni, which is Italian for Don Juan, which basically exposed the pure evil, satanic nature, of some of the oligarchy. And then he was able to go back to German language opera for the Magic Flute. Now, Ignaz von Born, the man from the metallurgy, Ben Franklin, had praised the head of the lodge that the head of the lodge, can you go back to von Born? Yeah. He's thought to be the model for the character of Zarastro in the Magic Flute. And by that point, it was clear to Mozart that you could not reform a nation simply by having a good leadership grouping that would try and be benevolent, which is what you have in the Magic Flute with Sarastro and his brotherhood, that you actually had to have a much more universal education of the population to self-governance. And he wrote a play that was an opera that was very revolutionary in that what he says is, if you're capable of falling in love, you're capable of governing. That's essentially the thesis of the magic flute. It's also interesting because the magic in the magic flute is the great music of Bach that Mozart had studied and was developing. He takes in one of the scenes, I think it's just before the prince and Tamino and Pamina, the hero and heroine, are going through their trials. He plays, or Mozart composed a piece that was clearly based on a C minor fugue of Bach. And everybody who knew that music at that time would have known that what Mozart was saying was the magic that could transform the population to be capable of governing was the music of Bach, was the fugues, was the great music. Now, the reaction on the part of the oligarchy was swift and it was vicious. Within days, they made preparations to have an empire. In 1788, Joseph was finally suckered into going into war against the Turks. It was a disaster all the way around, including he got a disease from which he died in 1790. His brother Leopold succeeded him and did some useful things, including making public the records of the secret. He fired Count Peregrine, the head of the Viennese secret police, and put public some of the records of what had been going on. He was following in Joseph's footsteps. Now, what the oligarchy clearly decided was they wanted a world without Leopold, without Mozart, and without all these principles and uppity people that they were having to deal with. And so, first thing they did was in mid-October, about the same time that Mozart told his wife that he thought he was being poisoned, the tutor for the crown prince, Franz, the one that stuffed this proud man Angelo, this satanic guy that took over, he had a tutor who was like Mozart, a protege of Baron von Swieten, but that tutor was fired, and Mozart was poisoned. And Swieten himself was dismissed from his post in the government the very day that Mozart died, December 5th, 1791. The Emperor Leopold, who'd been in otherwise good health, was dead within a few months. So you had you had Leopold, also Born died, von Swieten, etc. They're just all wiped out, in a counterattack. But as Dennis Speed said in his piece, Mozart's assassins are dead. But Mozart, like mankind, is immortal. And it was during the last few months of his life, he was commissioned to write a Requiem for the dead, which he quickly came to realize was going to be a Requiem, his own Requiem. And there's something very, very much to learn about the way Mozart decided to face death and use the last part of his mortality, for his immortality. Most of us, like the people who died on 9/11, don't know what day we're going to die. But we do have the power to use our lives to actually shape and transform the world by developing our identity based on our talents. We don't know when the phone's going to ring either. Based on our talents and then our commitment to sticking with that mission in a truthful way. And that is what Mozart did. That's what we're doing. That's what our Mozart Requiem concerts are aimed at doing. Now, we don't have, can you put the Requiem poster back up? We don't have the capability here yet, although our maestro Dorcil Duckins has joined us, and we probably eventually will. But we don't have the instrumentalists or the voices to do Mozart's Requiem yet. But about the same time that Mozart was working on the Requiem, in the summer of 1791, he also composed another small piece called Ave Verum Corpus, Hail, True Body of Christ. And our chorus wanted to perform that to give you a living idea of Mozart's music and what made him immortal. So if the chorus would come up.
You just gotta be careful if you don't want to put that marble. Keisha, you sing?
Do you want to tell us what it says?
I think you did.
Sorry.
I thought you gave everybody a
No,
copy.
I meant to, but I didn't end up getting a chance to come here.
Okay. But the interpretation of the Ave Verum Corpus is hell, true body, born of the Virgin Mary, truly having suffered sacrifice on the cross, and on the cross on behalf of man, whose pure side trickled water and blood, be thou for us a foretaste in the taste of death. That's the Ave Verum Corpus.
Small request, can everybody turn their phones on for the next 5 minutes? Yeah, including. Yeah.
No, she's gonna do it.
Maria, here. When the Ebony Opera Guild presented The Marriage of Figaro down at Miller Outdoor Theater, who did they choose for that mischievous, roundabout, diabolical, hubristic Figaro but Maestro Dorcio Duggan?
Yeah, I have a quick, oh, yeah.
So,
Yeah, just-
Jackie, whoever's first.
well, so, it's so sad to hear what you're saying about Joseph. I saw a French movie about the horrifying French Revolution, and it just horrifies me, you know, that all of these noble people were just, and even those who were trying to make a connection between the poor and the rich, they got, I mean, it's just awful. And so you're saying though that before Marie Antoinette, so what was the connection between Marie Antoinette and she was the sister of Joseph? And he's the one who did the reforms?
Yeah.
And she, I mean, this is,
I don't think she's what history has made her out to be.
that's awful.
Because otherwise it doesn't make sense that she would have wanted Beaumarchais' very anti-oligarchical play to be
performed.
Yeah.
And the only thing
But-
you hear about her is let them eat
Let
cake.
them
Let
eat
them eat
cake, which-
cake, that's
Yeah,
the whole
right.
thing.
As far as I know, she never said.
But even so,
Think that's a made-up story?
Uh-huh. Apparently so. Yeah, see, but the problem with the French was they didn't, I mean, and I, my father was a total fan of Charles Dickens, I'm not. But one of his books that I do recommend is Tale of Two Cities. Because what you realize is this was a population that was totally oppressed, was treated the way they treated Angelo Soliman, you know, was treated like beasts, and was not educated, was not developed. You didn't have a von Swieten salon. You didn't have the music of Mozart. You didn't have any of that. So that you had a population, unfortunately, a lot like ours these days, you know, which was beaten down and angry and had very few tools to respond in a human fashion, and therefore were able to be manipulated by the British into, you know, absolute rage and destruction. And that's what they were trying to avoid, is what they were doing in Austria. Yeah, Tim.
That's another question. From the Siege of Vienna in 1683, whatever it was, September the 11th, right? It's like until the time period that you're talking about is only 100 years. Now, have the Turks actually started to reform themselves, behave in a more Christian manner, or something like that during that space of time, or was Mozart just making this thing up about the Pasha?
I would, have you ever read a piece, we have copies of it if you haven't, called De Pace Fidei by Nicholas of Cusa?
No. I know that the Turks are responsible for every kind of grief and mayhem throughout the Balkans and
No,
throughout
what
all
he,
that area.
what he makes clear in that dialogue, and I haven't read it for a long time, but the idea is very simple. It's a dialogue of people representing various faiths, and they're all claiming to be the one who have the truth. And what, you know, what becomes clear by the end of the dialogue is that they all potentially have the truth if you get beyond rituals and go to principle. The principle of what it is, you know, that the nature of God and the nature of man is that they can all agree, and that there is no intrinsic conflict between the Muslims, the Buddhists, the Christians, the Jews. It's the same thing that that Lessing, the playwright, you know, discusses in his play Nathan the Wise, which is on exactly the same subject. And that's, see, if Americans were familiar with these things, if they knew Nicholas of Cusa, if you did, Ted, and knew, you know, Lessing and Nathan the Wise, and knew some of the history of this, you wouldn't fall sucker to the idea that Muslims are in some kind of incompatible, you know,
Yeah, I regard Islam as a special case.
Yeah,
I mean,
but you're
it's
wrong.
outside the normal rules.
See, you have not done the work that Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa did. You haven't done the work that Lessing did. You don't know your history. You don't know
Studied history an awful lot.
well, you've studied the wrong history then, which happens a lot with people. You know, and this is, they're trying to sucker you.
Okay, at least Nicholas Cusa people have heard of. I mean, some of your other heroes nobody's heard of, and Vladimir Vernadsky.
Well, you
I've
better-
gone out deliberately, you know, like
help us change that. That's the whole
I'm
idea
sorry.
of these meetings.
You know,
Pete had a question.
Yeah, it was just I thought that the Marriage of Figaro was performed like once in Vienna and then it was banned.
Became very popular.
Yeah, I don't know how I got that idea, but I got that idea.
If you think of the Don Giovanni.
Wasn't Bob Stewart active in the American Revolution?
No. Well, yes, no,
Not
there's
the
not
same
Sveten.
Von
Von Sveten is the guy that we're talking about here.
Ah.
And von Steuben, yes, was. Different people. But it shows once again that there were networks of people from the nobility in Europe, you know, who were very much committed to the cause of the American Revolution. Von Sveten was a diplomat who had been posted in Berlin, where he apparently got access to Bach's writings and brought them back to Vienna, where they were almost unknown. And then through this salon, they became known to, you know, a whole grouping of which the leaders, of course, musically were Haydn and Mozart. And then I thought it was very interesting that one of the people from these networks was the one, you know, Countess von Thun, who brought Beethoven in to make sure that he met Mozart. And it was those same people who then supported Beethoven. Yeah.
So the other week I was listening to one of the lectures that Andras Schiff does on the Beethoven piano sonatas, and he talked about what's called the Moonlight Sonata, which has nothing to do with moonlight. People, but because it's called that, people play it in this like dreamy, romantic way. What he was showing is that what Beethoven did is he borrowed a sort of a theme from Mozart's Don Giovanni, which is the theme of the funeral dirge for the father who gets slain by Don Giovanni in the opening scene. And so you have in the piano sonata an echo of the same kind of views that are written into Don Giovanni and other Mozart operas. And I just find it funny because, you know, in that cultural context, you had all these people who were sort of bouncing ideas off of each other, which had very profound context and discussion. And you contrast that with today, where everyone is trying to do something completely different from everyone else because you have copyright and you have all these other reasons why you can't even have a dialogue in the culture, especially one around ideas like overthrowing and ending the tyrannical privileges of self-anointed, you know, demagogues. So, but I just thought it was interesting because here, you know, it's another example of how you actually have a discussion across different musical so-called genres of a piano sonata and an opera that are taking on a similar thing.
And of people who only met each other once. And yet his ideas. By the way, I finally broke down in preparing for this class. I thought, well, I should maybe watch the movie Amadeus, which I've always refused to watch because it's a total slander of Mozart. So my brother, you know, lets me use his Netflix account, so I found it there. So I pulled it up. I suffered through 10 minutes. I had to turn it off. It's really awful. I mean, they're trying to kill Mozart again. But the two things that I found out in watching the first 10 minutes is, it's exactly what you're saying about, you know, calling it the Moonlight Sonata. It's all about this guy Salieri, who was in a personal tiff with Mozart, and if Mozart was killed, that's why. Because some guy who was, you know, in a personal tiff with him killed him. You know, was jealous, you know, of his music or his, you know, his ability to do music so easily, which is completely stupid to, you know, anybody that knows anything about Mozart and the role that he was playing, which unfortunately most people don't. Therefore, you know, you can take a movie like that and make it become famous. The other thing, and this is a warning to anybody who wants to listen to Mozart, is do not listen to the recordings of the man who conducted all the Mozart music in that movie. His name is Sir Neville Mariner. And much of the Mozart music these days, when we used to have a classical music station in Houston, and I would listen to it and they would play Mozart, And you hear it, and it's, you know how Mozart can be kind of like Muzak? He was always Sir Neville Mariner. It's like this guy was assigned. The oligarchy knows that they killed him, but they didn't kill him. And they're still trying to kill him with the way they're treating his life and his music. So there are a few pieces where Ferdinand conducted Mozart, which is the best, you know, but there are others who do not listen to Sir Neville Mariner if you love Mozart. Yeah, there's
You know, there is a CD of Mozart for study.
Sir Neville Mariner does?
No.
Oh, who?
There is a CD, even for your children, for study. And if you can go online and put in Mozart for study, and there's a compilation of songs of music just by Mozart that opens the mind for study.
Here's another question. When Mozart was writing in German, did they have such a thing as Deutsch at that time, or any kind of a standardized version of German? Or would his German be understood by people that speak regular German today? I mean,
I don't know enough about the German language, but Mozart, if you, for example, read Mozart's letters to people in his family, you can get compilations of them for a little. They're a little bit difficult to read because he's always making jokes in different languages, in French and in Italian and in Latin and in I don't know what all. You know, he knew, huh?
To his sister, horse face.
Yeah.
That's what
He knew many languages, and he wrote some songs in which he made fun of the Viennese dialect. You know, and he actually wrote the song, you know.
so you get all kinds of variations in Germany, right?
But in other words, Mozart was very aware of, you know, that there were variations. He knew many languages, including German and the dialects of German, well enough to be able to actually write songs that poked fun at some of the lower level ones. But I'm sure that he was very conscious of being able to write. See, he wasn't writing to just the average peasant on the street, although I imagine they could follow it somewhat. But you know, it's like the average person doesn't follow LaRouche's English either. But you know, but he was writing it to be capable of being understood by what you might call the bourgeoisie in Austro-Hungary at the time. And it clearly had a tremendous effect because you had, you had the development of a lot of scientific ideas, of reforms, of other things, and they had to literally just about kill everybody. They killed Joseph by getting him into this stupid war, and they used, I mean, it was I don't know all the details of it, but it reminds me a little bit of the Bill Clinton problem. Casanova was bringing in a young lady to try to seduce Joseph, who was unmarried. And, they somehow, through those kinds of influences, they were able to somewhat blackmail him, got him to go to the Turkish War. He died way earlier than he should have. And then his brother came in, who was a decent guy also, and they somehow got rid of him very quickly. Yeah, Diane.
I was just thinking that in the same light, Salieri may have been used because he was in the proximity, to do the poisoning, but he wasn't on his own any more than the girl in the blue dress was on her own. Right?
David Shaven's, and David Shaven is the person who knows more about Mozart than anybody on the planet, as far as I know. One of our members, he knows the music, he knows the history, he knows the networks. And his hypothesis is that guy Hoffman, who's shown in the picture with his sword pointing towards the back of Mozart, and who worked for the head of the secret police, Count Peregrine. I mean, think about it. Count Peregrine is the guy who stopped the collaboration between Mozart and the Emperor by arresting the very, very close confidant of the Emperor who was working with Mozart. And he was, what happened to Gunther, the man who was working with Mozart, was that he was jailed for a short time, and then he was exiled from the country, basically vanished. So he wasn't hurt physically that badly, apparently had pretty nice, lodgings when he was in jail, but it got him and the emperor out of direct collaboration with Mozart, which was the point.
I had a follow-up. You said that Beethoven was brought in to meet with Mozart.
Mozart, so
Did that happen? Did they meet?
Yeah.
And is there a record of that somewhere?
I don't know.
It would have been 17, that's, feel you don't.
Why don't you send it's in the biographies. They met very
Is it there?
briefly. It's in the Beethoven biographies and Mozart. Mozart gave Beethoven a piano lesson and said that this guy shows very, very great promise of Beethoven, because Beethoven was a lot younger than Mozart.
Just off of Ted's question, it just made me think about, and I didn't know whether you wanted to say anything very briefly about the role of the great musicians as well as the playwrights in creating national languages and uplifting the language for everybody
Oh,
involved.
do you want to say anything?
Well, I would just say that, Verdi was, actually took it upon himself to create an Italian language, a language for Italy.
Yeah, because you had
And
states, so you
Shakespeare
didn't have
also,
populations.
Shakespeare also was involved in creating an English for the population, which I can tell you today,
That was lost.
I mean, people
Yeah,
can't even
didn't receive
comprehend, Shakespeare today because it's degenerated so much. Although anyone who goes and makes an effort will learn a tremendous amount from it. But I'm just saying, the issue's not did everybody understand it. The issue was that there was a very conscious effort to reach a population to bring them up to a higher level in every way, with the great operas that he did. So,
Point. That reminds me, actually, another one of the groupings around this guy Schikaneder, who was the manager of the theater in which the Magic Flute and some of the other things were performed. He was involved with a group that was translating Shakespeare into German, and they were doing a lot of work with Shakespeare's plays, in German. So that's
Is
exactly.
this the same time as
That's part of that, what you were talking about. Schikaneder, by the way, played Papageno in the first performance of.
is that part of the, when the Yiddish Renaissance was going on? Because I know
No, the Yiddish Renaissance is later. The Yiddish Renaissance is at the end of the 1800s.
Oh, okay.
And mostly in Eastern Europe.
Because they translated
I mean,
a lot
but
of
you did
Shakespeare.
what you're referring to, I think, is Moses Mendelssohn, and that grouping Moses Mendelssohn, and a grouping in Berlin, which worked on things like Plato. Remember, Moses Mendelssohn wrote his own version of Plato's last dialogue, the Phaedo, calling it the Phaedon, about the question of immortality. And when Mozart first came to Vienna, one of the first places he stayed was in an apartment, most of whose tenants were the Arnstein family. Fanny Arnstein was related to the Mendelssohn family, and she had brought the Phaedon with her from Berlin when she moved to Vienna, and it's known that Mozart had a copy of the Phaedon by Mendelssohn and read it. He also was very familiar with Lessing's works. So those were all around a little bit earlier in the same period. But that's not what's referred to as the Yiddish Renaissance. That's
Yeah, right.
late 1800s. But yeah, they did. There was and as I said, there were all kinds of restrictions against Jews in Vienna in the late 1700s. You couldn't be in town or not. You had to licenses. They didn't even have a ghetto for the Jews where they could at least, live and be left in peace. They had to live, in the city, but under, massive restrictions in the way they were treated. So it's also very interesting that, here's this one apartment complex with a large Jewish family, the Arnsteins, and that's where Mozart stayed when he first got there. Second place he stayed.
But they had to stay real close with the language because otherwise the message would be lost. What we get now in the translation of the operas and stuff like that, the English translation, if you don't know the language, misled with what, that, they're just lazy
Yeah.
with the English translation of these pieces now, like this, a lot of times, if you don't know the language,
Who did the English translations for the Figaro when you guys did it?
I would think it would be the same, the producer of the piece itself, when they wrote it for,
Anyway, I find it interesting because there is obviously a translation problem, but actually
Yeah.
watching the opera in the language that I knew, speaking of what you're saying, Ted, you understand so much more of what's going on in terms of the action of the drama of the opera. It's really
because
strong.
we had to go and actually go into the language itself and know every word.
So you knew the Italian and then
Yes,
the
yes, we
English.
had to know that. Otherwise, you're standing there frowning, talking about "I love you."
Didn't you do it in English, Dorcius?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I
Yes,
thought.
but we had to make that translation, you know, we had to go in
Yeah.
and really deal with the language. Otherwise, the interpretation was lost in a lot of the English. I think the interpreters were just kind of lazy.
Oh, yeah, they just write a nice phrase that they.
I want to ask another question, I'm sorry, because I've wondered about that. Like, you know, like I was watching this 13-year-old girl performing on America's Got Talent, right? You know, she's an opera singer. She was obviously singing a piece in Italian, right? And I was wondering, she almost had to speak Italian in order to do that, right? I mean, or am I wrong?
No. They don't have to speak the language. They just learn how to pronounce the words.
Okay, but I mean, she's got to have some idea of
What she's saying,
you know.
not necessarily, if you know the piece. See, there are a lot of people who can sing the piece, but not with interpretation.
So that you don't get like all opera singers that sing Italian parts that deal with that one Italian.
Oh, no, man, if you're on that level, you have to know what you're saying. Sylvia would eat you alive. And she would not even coach, she would not coach you if you didn't know the
And that was in
language
English.
of the piece. You know, she wouldn't spend any time with you. You had to know the
He's
language.
referring to Sylvia Oldenlee, the famous first African-American vocal coach at the Met.
Yeah, you had to know your line, you had to know that language, what you were saying. Each word, you had to know what that word was.
Say that when you get up to a certain level with opera singing, you have to know the
You got to
languages.
know it, yeah, because otherwise, they know when you're up there, sort of faking it.
Yeah.
Can you imagine going to Milan and trying to sing and not knowing the words you're singing in Italian?
I don't see how you can do it.
Yeah, of course you have to do it. You have to know that.
I mean, you
Well,
could
you can
do
tell-
it, but the inflection in the voice and the upping and the rising and all of that would be different when you know the language than it is when you just listen to someone professionally do it and emulate it.
Yeah, because
or
if you're not trying to.
imitate it, what they did.
Exactly.
And
If
a
you're
lot
not
of
trying to.
singers did that.
Oh, I'm sorry, Joseph.
Yeah, but a lot of singers did that. I mean, Martina Aurora could not read music, and her coach taught her by rote those songs. You know, well, he had to teach her the melodic line, but then she had to go and translate the language so that she was going to do it.
Because there's a different, it's the reason why are you performing a particular piece? To convey an idea to the people in the audience or to be a performer? I mean, there was a hilarious thing on the news a few months ago about some local city councilman who had gotten up at a baseball game to sing the national anthem.
Yeah.
And he apparently, and it's in English as far as I know, and he got about half the words wrong.
Yeah.
Because he wasn't trying to convey any ideas, he was trying to be up there, to make a performance, and that's what happens most of the time. That, but people don't tend to think about the fact that the music itself, even just, the language aside, but the music itself conveys an idea, and the words, and supplements the ability of the words, to convey that idea. And think about, you've heard a little bit of the Mozart Requiem. You can Google Schiller Institute Mozart Requiem on, the internet. And you can find, it's an hour and 40 minutes. It's the Requiem performance that the Schiller Institute did. There's a different group of people. By the way, what are we saying now, Keisha? There'll be 160 singers or something like that at one of these? Keeps growing.
Yeah.
We have
Boston, of course, makes it
in any case, but this was quite a few different people in Boston, but it was done in honor of John Kennedy, and it was done on the 50th anniversary of the date where Jackie Kennedy had done a performance at the Archdiocese in Boston in 1964. And it's well worth listening to because, one, we actually explained why we're doing it with Matt Ogden and Helga LaRouche, and then there's the Requiem, but interspersed somewhat is some of John Kennedy's short, clips from his speeches. And I think that no matter what you intend to do for September 11th, which is a week from tomorrow, that's one thing that everyone should do, is listen to the Mozart Requiem, and preferably that performance, because speaking of conveying ideas, it's one of the best. Because we did, on that day, lose 2,977 Americans. And we have begun to crack the cover-up with the 28 pages being released on July 15th. But we've got to bring down a regime which is as evil as the Emperor of France. We've got to bring down this apparatus in the United States that we've been living under since at least 9/11, 2001, which has tried to suppress the ability of human beings to be human and create the circumstances in which they can be enslaved and in which we're going to see the end of civilization if we don't. So, two things that everyone should go away from here, please, planning to do. One is to listen to that Requiem, and the other is to get some of the. Do we have some of the current issue of the? Of the broadsheet that we've been getting out in New York, and we've been making 2/3 size copies, for here. Get them around and make sure that your congressman knows on September 6th that his first job when he gets back to Congress is to pass the Glass-Steagall legislation.
That's another question. It's like, does LaRouche Peck have any kind of a problem with the idea of believing that those two buildings in New York really were destroyed by the two airplane strikes? I see this on forums on Facebook, all the time. I don't have a problem with believing that, there actually are buildings that would withstand being hit by 767. They're all in Egypt, right?
Yeah, but the court promised.
There were three buildings that fell that day,
There are three buildings, building seven.
Building 7 wasn't hit.
And there was molten steel under those buildings. Where did the molten?
I don't know what happened.
Let me just interrupt for a second before this discussion starts going.
I'm sorry.
Because the way you solve a murder is not to check, how the wound was done, or whether they were killed with a knife, or whether they were killed with a gun, or whether they were knifed and then shot to cover up with the knifing. That's not how you solve a murder. You solve a murder with cui bono. Who benefited? Why did Lyndon LaRouche know on January 3rd of 2001 that this was going to happen? Because he did an international webcast and he said George W. Bush and his administration are not going to be able to put through the economic policies they need because they're so vicious and the austerity is so terrible that the population will revolt unless they have some kind of dictatorship. So look out, because he said, I know the way the Bush family and Cheney operate, and you're going to see something the equivalent of a Reichstag fire in the United States. And on the day that the planes attacked the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, the day of the attack, what happened was we were out in Washington, D.C. There may have been some people here that were, I think Joe was one of the people. He had to go home and finish cooking dinner. But, we had people there handing out a leaflet warning about an imminent terrorist attack.
On the day it happened. On the day it happened.
On the day it happened.
See, I was working across the street from Union Station.
Ted, I don't want to get farther into the particulars of it, please. I really don't, because that's not the issue. The issue is the British, through the Saudis, ran an attack on the United States more vicious than and with more casualties than Pearl Harbor. And instead of shutting them down and making them pay for it, you know, and instead of the, you know, British Empire being, you know, finished off by being known, I mean, we proposed in 2000, before even the terror attacks happened in the United States, that the Great Britain be made one of the nations listed on the UN list of terror sponsoring nations. And we went through the evidence of that. So that's the question that you want to have, as the Pasha says, you don't want vengeance, you want justice. And you don't need the details, we need we need to bring the empire down. And they will not survive Glass-Steagall.
Was there any real model for this Pasha, or is it just something out of whole cloth?
Okay, all these questions popped up, I'm trying to think of all the questions. Okay, one is, this one's away from Mozart for a second, but is the internet gonna be censored starting with, I'm hearing this like rumor that NATO or somebody's gonna be given charge of the internet?
Well,
Is
see,
anybody else
if
hearing
NATO and Obama had all the power that all these people on the internet say they do, to scare people, the 28 pages would have never become public.
So you're not, so that, you just don't believe that all
They're
of a
given
sudden?
They would like to
UN
do.
or somebody.
Or the UN, I'm sorry,
somebody's
UN.
taking it, something.
No, the UN is a nice,
Cause I don't wanna lose my ability to do stuff on my.
Well, then see, what I'm saying is, the best way to make sure that doesn't happen is to finish off their power. And their power comes from the fact that, two things. One is that that the American population can't think, does not trust its own
The internet
judgment.
away, it's gonna make it even worse for us.
So, but think about the effect. Think about the effect of 4 performances of Mozart's Requiem, 4 days in a row in the New York City area. You're talking about thousands of people in the Bronx, where they were trying to create race riots with Black Lives Matter, and we were in there organizing for the Requiem, and people said to the people who, Black Lives Matter, race riot organizers, get the hell out of here. This isn't about race, this is about the economy. We need real solutions, and we're having the first performance in the Bronx right near where that incident happened. The second one is in a Episcopal Cathedral on Park Avenue, which holds 2,000 people. And don't ask me how that happened, but that's where the second one is going to be. In the afternoon, we're having a seminar. Then the third one is the Archdiocese of Brooklyn. This is the Archdiocese that has a commemoration every year because there was a whole company of firefighters. I guess that's the right term. Anyway, there were about 40 firefighters that rushed to the World Trade Center, and they were helping people get out, and they all got killed. And so what they do every September 11th is they march from Ground Zero, where the World Trade Center was, to the cathedral and have a mass. But this year they're going to have the mass, but they've asked us to do the Requiem as part of it.
Now, are you all familiar that the 9/11 people are interested in the 9/11 truth movement in a possibility of a truth and reconciliation way, the way they did apartheid South Africa, where people would spill their guts and start confessing to things if they knew that they would not be, hanged or, given the electric chair or whatever. Are you familiar, or is LaRouche?
You can't do that because as long as you've got this dictatorship in place, which is what's Wall Street, it's Obama, it's Cheney and company, it ain't gonna happen. You're not gonna be able to promise somebody
Anything like that, so.
Yeah, it's not gonna happen. So we've gotta bring that down if the truth is gonna come out, and you have to give people the strength to be able to do it. And remember, we're not at just any moment in history. We're at a Berlin Wall kind of moment. We're at a moment where, just like communism collapsed virtually overnight, and nobody saw it coming except for Lyndon LaRouche, who said a year earlier it was going to happen. We're at one of those kinds of moments where things could change. This financial system, when the Bank for International, or let's put it this way, when CNBC puts out a story called "Banks Preparing for Economic Nuclear Winter," that the thing is about to blow. They admit there are hundreds of billions of dollars as assets in the banks that are what are called Class 3 derivatives. They're called class 3 because nobody knows what they're worth because nobody could sell them. Nobody would buy them. And yet they're in the banks and they're on the books for hundreds of billions of dollars.
Trillions.
Yeah, for hundreds of trillions, but the class 3, you know, babies. But you're right, you're right, John. Now, what the other thing is, the Chinese, see, when Bill Clinton proposed a new financial architecture and they used, the Monica Lewinsky operation to put an end to that, this is what the Chinese are talking about now. And they're not gonna have to worry about any Monica Lewinskys. But they're gonna have to deal with Obama, they're gonna have to deal with Merkel, they're gonna have to deal with all these idiots from the West. And so they asked the Bank for International Settlements, which is the central bank of central bankers, for a report on the status of derivatives. And they got it, and the BIS said that of the 600 trillion, as John is saying, derivatives holdings, if one party was to fail on its obligations, there is nothing in the way of the crisis ripping through the entire system and bringing down the whole system. They said there was something set up called clearinghouses, CCPs, which in fact, instead of being in the way of it, spreading, might actually trigger a collapse. So this thing is about to go. Now the question is, does it get replaced? Do we have a French Revolution? Do we have a nuclear war? Or do we have Glass-Steagall? And where does the leadership come from to push that through? Well, that's what our aim is with these. And we're doing, the combination of the Requiems, but we're also getting out. Getting out those. The ones we get out of New York are actually full newspaper size every week. This is the fourth one. That's the third one.
Sure.
We have the fourth one we're getting out today.
And everybody could get 10 of these out easily. Just stick them on your neighbor's doors. If you don't have family members, you can get them to. So 10 is the minimum you should take with you today, and you're welcome to take 50 or 100 if you get them out.
Let me ask you another question. Look, it's like, suppose you've got some politician who really doesn't know anything about Glass-Steagall and banking at all, right? And he's sitting there asking you, like, what all do you really need, right? It's like, it starts with Glass-Steagall, right? But I mean, that by itself can't fix the whole problem with banking and money. What all, if you had to list like 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 things, what would they all be?
LaRouche's 4 laws, and we can print you out, copy them. Glass-Steagall is number 1. Number 2, the problem then, if you implement Glass-Steagall, is what? That the actual legitimate part of the banking system that would be
sitting up protected. What do you do with the rest of this stuff? I mean,
you write it up, you close down the banks.
you just say, so that's number 2.
No, that's number 1. But the problem is that there's a very tiny amount of assets in the actual commercial banking sector that would be, defended. So where does the credit come from once most of the big banks are shut down because they're bankrupt? And then you've got these little banks, they've got a very small amount of capital. Where's the credit going to come from for a giant rebuilding of the U.S. economy? That's number 2.
The federal government doesn't
Yeah,
wrong.
it does, in Hamiltonian banking, a national bank. Just like
So you want to recreate the national bank like in the 1820s or something like that, and that's step number 2?
That's step number 2. Step number 3 is create productive jobs. And step number 4 is a science driver, fusion and the space program.
When you say create productive jobs, then you get into kind of a sticky wicket, right? You don't want to be having, in order just to make work for people. I don't think you want people doing things which would be better being done by machines, right?
We don't need to just make work for people. I don't know if anybody here but me is so unfortunate as to read the Houston Chronicle. But this morning, front page, it's got a front page big story about the dams in Houston, how old and dirty and dangerous they are. And
Most people don't know that
That's what
you're
you're
used.
yeah, people don't even know. I didn't know, but people have heard of the Addicks Reservoir and the Barker Reservoir, which are out there in Katy, and they were full, during the spring rains and things. Well, they are created by, I guess it's earthen dams, is that right, Joel?
Yeah, that one is, I believe.
And the dams that create those 2 reservoirs, out of however many dams there are in the United States of America, and there are thousands, those 2 dams are in the top 6 most dangerous, most likely to collapse and create a catastrophe.
Oh my God.
And of the top 6, there are only 2 that are in a residential area, and those are the Addicts and the Barker reservoirs.
What would they do if they were remote job?
Well, they-
Six
they work-
6,000 people killed there.
How many?
6,000.
6,000 people could die if one of those dams or both
Yes.
of them collapsed?
Right.
Wow.
And billions of dollars worth of property damage. I mean, there is so much stuff. Talk to Helga LaRouche about the roads between Washington DC and New York.
So, a minimum
Yeah.
set of
Or
things
even
that
letter
you need
release.
to Glass
In
Steagall.
fact, let me just make sure the people have looked at this. Is there an orange pamphlet there? Because this came up with somebody else earlier this thing. There's a section in here, excuse me, find it, on high-speed rail. Have people read this? If you haven't read it, you know, I recommend reading it. It's not very long. In order to create, we figure you would need 42,000 miles of electrified high-speed rail in the United States. In order to do that, we would need to produce 10,000 locomotives, 1,000 power substations, 1.5 million tons of high tensile steel, 22 million tons of cement, and 50 gigawatts of power production.
That sounds like enough work for a lot of people. All
Now-
I'm saying is that you want the work to be meaningful work, right? And you gotta pay-
Oh, sure. But you know, as much as he's slandered, that's what Roosevelt did. He said, I mean, they did a few, you know, jobs to get people to work right away as soon as he came in. But then very quickly he said, people deserve their dignity. And they don't get dignity from just doing something that's useless. Their dignity derives from doing some work
Doing useful work.
that is useful, yeah. And he made sure that the jobs that were created, you know, and
So is that the whole list? I mean, Glass-Steagall, like a,
Glass-Steagall, national banking, productive jobs, in a science driver, a fusion, and a space program.
okay, that's the basic gist of what you want.
And that's LaRouche's 4 crucial laws, and we need all of them. Because, you know, the example I use is the Glass-Steagall is like a tourniquet.
Right.
You know, you have to stop the patient from bleeding to
When you
death.
talk about a national bank at this point in time, then you're not talking about, well, like borrowing money into existence anymore, right? You've got to be talking about the government being able to create money.
You're talking about the government creating credit.
Credit.
What about the Federal Reserve? How does that figure into LaRouche's steps?
Well, I don't know, you could either, you know, take it down or turn it into a national bank, depending on what.
The problem is,
I mean, you won't have a Federal Reserve that's owned by private bankers, that's what we have right now.
yeah, we pay them interest on money that the federal government could just make up out of thin air if they want to, just like the Federal Reserve does, but we're having to pay them interest for it. That's the difference.
I mean, banks create money out of thin air.
Is that-
See, the people who own the Federal Reserve and run the Federal Reserve, having been bankrupted and shut down, won't be able to object to, you know, reorganization, whether it puts them out of business or turns them into a national bank. The problem is that the power resides right now with the people who have money and therefore political power, because the population, which should have the power, by the use of their minds to fight for the ideas that are needed for the future, don't use their minds. And therefore don't fight for the future, and therefore continually are kept enslaved. And then people talk about institutions, the United Nations, the Federal Reserve, the this, the that, as if you could take all those institutions away tomorrow and you wouldn't have anything change in the
Right.
United States if you didn't change the minds of a,
Sure.
yes. And not all the population, but you have to have, you know, you might call it a vanguard, you have to have, you know, a leadership. that
So
takes
it's
it.
like Venezuela, I was hearing that that's just such a catastrophe that Chavez was giving away free stuff, but he was, you know, the people are sitting
See,
around.
don't try and figure out any of the nations in South America by themselves. Because 2 years ago, you had a meeting in Brazil, at Fortaleza, Brazil, of the BRICS nations, and they brought them together with the nations of South America. And they made all kinds of plans for investment in rail lines and water systems and power systems and everything else. And ever since that time, you know, every single nation in South America has been subject to an attempted color revolution, you might call it. They just impeached Dilma. I mean, they impeached Dilma on the fact that, you know, she overdrew the checkbook of the government, basically. You know,
Our president would be gone.
yeah. I mean, it was a coup, which she said, but she said it was a coup from inside the country, when in fact it was a coup from Washington and London, and that's what they didn't say. You know, Christina not only, you know, was not able to get her candidate to be elected as the new president in Argentina, but the candidate of the oligarchs. But they're now threatening to jail her, and you know, her security has been stripped, and you know, they published in the newspapers all the details of who guarded her and when and how and where, and you know, here's where to shoot her and here's who to get out of the way before you do. And you know, now they're trying an operation in Bolivia with the miners and the striking there and all of that. I mean, the whole continent is under assault to try to destroy every country. And they hold up one and they say, well, here's the problem with this one, here's the problem. You know, it's like saying the reason everybody's wet is because, you know, they weren't paying attention where they were going. Maybe it's because they're on the Titanic. You know, it's the term fallacy of composition is really important, because most news, and this is the problem in the US, you've noticed this, I'm sure, that you'll hear this or that or the other thing, but you know, it's never in the context of there are two paradigms battling it out on the planet for what future we will have as this transatlantic system collapses and something new replaces it. Are we going to have chaos, or are we going to have collapse, or are we going to have nuclear war, or are we going to have the world land bridge, a new financial architecture, you know, and a wonderful future for mankind, the kind that we see.
Okay, oh, I don't know. Can I answer?
You can answer the question over here.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was gonna ask you, I guess that's one of the reasons why, they're bombarding the airways with all these, ways to get along, ways to get mortgage, ways to get credit card. I mean, it seems you can't turn on your television nowadays without hearing about, hey, here's another one. And I mean, we still get junk mail and, you know, cards that are being offered to you.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I know quite a few friends of mine who are up to it. And they always say the same thing, and you know, how do you do it?
Slavery.
Yeah, how do you do it? I said, I don't have any credit cards. You don't? Why not?
See, that's another, to me, that's a problem, that we see things to consume, and we don't have the ability to control our wants, and, you know, we're just so brainwashed into thinking, you know, I see that in my community, that somebody will wanna ask me out on a date who just bought a brand new shiny truck, a pickup truck, and then 3 weeks later, he's knocking on my door, can I borrow $20? I need gas for my pickup truck. You know, and he doesn't even have a job
Well, let me
where
ask
he
you.
can use the pickup truck.
I'm sorry, what is your name, sir?
Jose.
Jose.
You know, this is a big problem.
But Jose, you know, if you think about it, do you know what percentage of people in the United States now work at some job that actually produces anything physical? What would you guess?
30%,
13.
13.
And what did it used to be in the heyday, let's
Wow.
say 40 years ago?
40-50%, something
Yeah.
that maybe Joel remembers. You know,
Hey, it was
And
55.
see,
and
I
early
was gonna tell you,
50s.
I came from a town in the West Texas that was renowned for its manufacturing plants. And they had a renowned plant that was called Farah at one time. And everybody used to want to graduate because that was the place to go get a job.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, you went there because they provided, I mean, the pay wasn't that great, but it was decent enough that everybody had a brand new car. I mean, everybody could get pants at the factory price, which was like $4.50 versus $9. You know, and you know, slowly, I gotta say, you know, not me take anything away from them, because now I'm a member of them, but the unions came in and they said, no, you shouldn't be able to work for this. You should, you know, stick to wanting to ask for more, because you know what, that's the right thing to do.
You see, the problem with the unions is not that they asked for more, but that they didn't fight to make sure that there's a little 10-minute, 12-minute video on our website. And who do you talk to here?
I believe Joe.
Joe?
Yeah.
I'll have him make sure that he sends this to you. It's called An Introduction to LaRouche's Economics. And he starts, it's Jason Ross, who's a delightful teacher. And he starts with this question of the minimum wage and how you got Bernie Sanders and Hillary and everybody running around saying we're going to have $15 minimum wage.
Yeah.
Right, right, it is. They said, okay, well, what about $100 minimum wage? $100 an hour minimum wage, you know? But then you've got a problem, which is this economy, then you can buy whatever you need and want, right?
Sustain it.
Except for the question is this economy capable of producing it?
Right.
And you see, as a trade unions, demanding higher wages without fighting for a policy for the nation that ensured that the nation was capable of producing, you know, what people needed to buy to have a better standard of living. They did that under FDR, but they didn't do that, you know, starting in the 80s especially. They got on into being, just the shop stewards who worry about their own local problems. And that's our problem. Our nation has to be able to have its citizens reassemble themselves, and they've got to reflect on the question of what kind of future do we want for our children and grandchildren. And nobody, what's been sold to people was, as the decision was made, they shot John Kennedy. You know, you had, we lost FDR, then John Kennedy tried to bring the same policies back, they shot him. You know, and then increasingly they started to shut down the space program because that was making people uppity and think they didn't have to limit their resources, that we could continue to create new science and technology to create more, which is true. But so it was shut down. Then you had the beginnings of shutting down all the industries. And what do people get instead? Well, you can invest in this and make money. You can invest in the stock market, or you can invest in a bond, or you can put your money here, you can put your money there, you can put your money in an annuity, and you can make money. Well, shouldn't somebody have said, but wait a minute, all the production's being shut down, you know, where's the money coming from? But people didn't do that. They didn't take the responsibility to figure it out. They didn't have leadership, and LaRouche took the responsibility to figure it out in the 1960s.
Yeah.
He warned about it in 1971, won a debate over that very question, you know, in 1971. But what was the reaction of, you know, the establishment in the United States? It was to send a messenger to say to LaRouche, you won the debate about economics, but you lost the war because we're never going to allow you to be heard from again by the American people.
You've done a good job.
But, well,
To
yes.
a certain extent, you know.
Yeah,
what
to
I'm
a
saying?
certain extent,
Yeah.
that's true. You know, but think about it, since that time, he influenced two presidents, Reagan, whose administration he would have run had it not been for Reagan being shot. You know, and Bush moved in and took over while Reagan was shot, and LaRouche was, for the most part, pushed out, but we still got the SDI, LaRouche's policy.
What is
You
it?
know?
The Star Wars, which one? The SDI?
Yeah, SDI.
And that's the Star Wars
No.
program?
That's,
Strategic Defense Initiative.
the Star Wars is what the media called it, to say, you don't want this.
Oh,
It's
so
just
that was a
gonna-
negative, whatchamacallit?
Sure, it's gonna
Okay.
mean war in space.
Uh-huh.
No, it was gonna mean, you know, not having war on Earth or in space.
Uh-huh.
But SDI, yeah, that was
SDI.
LaRouche's policy. He negotiated it, he developed it. We had a big parade in Washington DC in what was it? 82? No, it was before the
86,
SDI.
87?
Well, we had several of them. The one before,
84.
you know, before Reagan came. Anyway, we were organizing for it all over the country. You know, so LaRouche, you know, we both organized the institutions, like Mozart was organizing the ability, and we organized a section of the population. And we got the policy change, and we got Clinton to go with what he called the new financial architecture. But, you know, the problem is that when they went after LaRouche after the Reagan thing, I mean, you know, you could read in every newspaper in the United States about Lyndon LaRouche the crook, who stole people's money, who never gave it back, who lived in luxury, who, you know, I mean, all this stuff was all over the place, you know, over and over and over again. When he was sent to trial in Boston, And there was a 5-month trial in which only the government's prosecution argument was presented. We never even got to the defense because people who had been there for 5 months had health problems and other things,
my
so they had to be,
gosh.
they had to call a mistrial. But the 12 jurors and the 2 alternates voted. They said, look, we spent 5 months on this thing. We're gonna vote on what we would have said. Based on the government's prosecution case,
Wow.
they voted that LaRouche and all of his associates were innocent. And if anybody was guilty of a crime, it was the government.
And that's after hearing all of the
Government.
the government stuff
Yes.
and not hearing the defense,
Yeah.
and they still said he was innocent.
They still said it. But that never came out in the media.
How did they put him in
That is
jail after that?
amazing.
Well,
They
what
have
they
like
did
a
is there was
trial.
one little article in the Boston paper that reported it. What they did was they re-indicted him, this time in what was called the rocket docket in Alexandria, Virginia. You're familiar with Alexandria? And the rocket docket had a higher prosecution rate, conviction rate than the Soviet courts did.
Wow.
And they this time
As a matter of
said,
fact, their mascot was a kangaroo.
oh yeah? The mascot was a kangaroo, Joel says.
It was a
And
mistrial.
they said, you can't introduce any evidence that would show the government was guilty and set you up. That was the ruling that the judge made before the trial started. You're only gonna be able to allow introduction of the government evidence that shows that you're guilty of what they say you're guilty of. And they literally ran a railroad. I mean, it was, LaRouche was indicted in October, he was convicted in December. And this was with thousands of pages of evidence, and when the conviction came through, the judge, whose name I forget, because I forget the names of people.
Brian.
Huh? Brian, yeah, I forget the names of people I don't like, but I guess it was Brian. Said, that judge in Boston owes me a cigar. I did what he couldn't do. I sent LaRouche to jail.
And the other thing is, he was convicted on Beethoven's birthday and put in prison on Mozart's birthday.
People hear that?
Was that deliberate or just a coincidence?
Just a coincidence.
It was deliberate. These guys know their history very well.
What, wait a second. Where did they get these thousands of pieces of evidence? I mean, or did they just fabricate it, or did they skew it to make it look like a?
They skewed it. For example, they said, we took loans without planning to pay people back. Well, the part they left out was that the
Financial
government
warfare.
bankrupted our companies and took them over and didn't allow repayment. But that part the jury never heard. They only heard we took a loan, people didn't get paid back, and therefore these people are obviously involved in a conspiracy to steal people's money.
Plus, the jury foreman was working with Oliver North.
Yeah.
Who was working?
The jury foreman was part of the continuity of government task force that Oliver North was on for emergency government and time of crisis.
There's a movie coming out called Snowden. Check it out.
Well, there's a lot of news about Snowden.
No,
There's a
Snowden.
new one.
The new one coming out.
So he should laugh tonight. Does anybody know whether there's going to be the conference next Saturday in New York and
There
Manhattan?
is a conference, are you talking about?
But is it being simulcast?
Broadcasts.
Well, are you talking about which one, the one on the 9/11 Truth Movement's conference?
No,
Oh, no,
the
there was
Schiller
ours.
Institute.
You guys, oh, I don't, yeah. Conference.
Well, we'll let you know. We'll have a meeting